In the shadows whisper low, demons lurking in the glow. Ancient voices call our names through the fire and the flames. Demons are real, feel the fear, their whispers dancing your
Up in the sky, what do I see? A UFO is looking at me. Lights flashing all around, bass bumping from the ground. Aliens grooving to the beat, hip-hop rhythms got them on their feet. Strange beings shaped to the flow, spaceships rocking to the show. I see a UFO flying high in the night, moving to the sound, everything's alright. Dancing the stars and neon light, hop to the beat till the morning light. I see a UFO flying high in the night, moving to the sound, everything's alright. Dancing in the stars under neon light, hop to the beat till the morning light. I see a UFO flying high in the night, moving to the sound, everything's alright. Dancing the stars and neon light, hop to the beat till the morning light. I'm the god, I rise and shine. In this realm I'm divine. Like the world was just a sign. Feel the power, it's all mine. All mine. Thunder claps, the sky obeys. In my hands lightning plays. Mountains bow, the ocean sway. I command night and day. I'm a god, feel the force. Every star on my course. Follow me, I'm the source. Life itself, no remorse. From the clouds to the ground, in my glory you are
Yeah.
found.
Good,
Eternal
wonderful,
life will
wonderful, fantastic morning. Oh my goodness. I can't believe it. First of all, can you believe we are back for episode 81? You know, I can believe it because I planned on being here for this many and more episodes. But I didn't plan on how fast we would get here. I mean, fast. Like, I know it's been a couple of years, but those couple of years, like, honestly seem like just a few months to me. Like, it seems like we just been doing this for months, and that was it, and we're already at 81 episodes. I mean, I honestly can't even fathom it. Anyway, today is episode 81 titled Remus. And you know, I just finished a few days ago this long audio book I was listening to, which was awesome, about ancient Rome. And, it occurred to me while I was listening to it and after, what if, and this could be repeated throughout history, but what if what didn't happen in Rome happened? What if it wasn't Romulus that survived and killed Remus, but it was Remus who killed Romulus? What would be different? What if it was the Etruscans instead of the Italians and the Romans who ended up conquering all of the Italian peninsula? What if they they lost to Mithridates and Mithridates conquered Rome? And then you could repeat this throughout history. You can keep going. What if Julius Caesar wasn't murdered? What if Alexander the Great didn't go into India and decided to turn back and shore up his lands instead of what he didn't do was just conquer and leave? Instead, and he decided to go back and establish government and all these different things. What if it was the Greeks who conquered the Romans instead of the Romans conquering the Greeks? What if it was, all these different things? So, what if and we have spoken in the past about the differences in thoughts behind Julius Caesar, his plans, his ideas, and he literally was loved by the people and hated by the Senate. And oh, by the way, I see the link come up there for our website. I fixed the live view on the website so you could actually watch our show live on the website now too. So you could just click that and watch it there and whatever. And you could view the chat. You just can't chat. You have to come on to Twitch or Kick to chat. But whatever, you can still view it. Be awesome. And so that's there. It's cool. So that's awesome too. We fixed that. Fixed a whole bunch of things. Set up the new camera, although it's not it's not set up the way I wanted it originally, but we'll fix it, I guess. We'll get it better. But anyway, so it occurred to me the whole time we're talking about it, like, what if Pompey won instead of Julius Caesar? What if Julius Caesar's efforts in Egypt to install Cleopatra on the throne was fruitless, and it was her what's interesting, let's start with something interesting. Some historical texts claim that it was her brother that they were fighting against, Cleopatra's brother. And some historical texts claim that it was her sister that they were fighting against. That's really interesting because usually historical contexts like that are actually very simple. And if it was the sister, that would be extremely more explosive because Egypt was an extremely patriarchal society. And having a female pharaoh is extremely rare. There were about like 3 or 4 before Cleopatra, but that's all we know about. If there were more than that, we haven't found any evidence for them. So to have the throne be versus 2 women in Egypt is extremely rare and explosive and shows just how Egypt has changed over the thousands of years. So if it wasn't and then what if it was the woman and all those texts that were saying it was her brother were rewritten in some sort of patriarchal, misogynist context or whatever? Well, what does that say about the society? It says a lot of things. I point to the example of what was her name? The female gladiator of one of the first ones who went out. Mava, the female gladiator Mava. And there was one of the writers of Rome, one of the what were they called? They wasn't like a scribe, but it was like I don't know. He did a lot of writing, and he would publish a lot of works and speak to the public, and he had the emperor's ear and stuff. And anyway, so he witnessed Mava and was like, "Oh, this woman, and she's a woman. She can't do this male role. How dare she? She doesn't know her gender. Blah blah blah. All those things, whatever." And then she gets in the arena and she wins, and she's loved by the crowd, and goes on to fight more and more fights and wins. I mean, that's it's a change from the norm, sure, but it goes to show how, even no matter how you try to write it, the truth always comes out in the end. And in the end, people didn't see those things. The average person in the streets of Rome didn't give a shit if it was a woman gladiator or a man gladiator. They just wanted some entertainment to keep them from their terrible, horrible daily lives. I mean, that's all they cared about. And but these people who were so wealthy that they had other things to care about, they're the ones who gave a shit that she was a female gladiator. And they're the ones, unfortunately, who had the money to write and the time to write all these things because they weren't worried about their day-to-day income. And and even in this book, I like how they pointed out too, it's mostly the wealthy who we can look back onto history today. We don't really have a lot of evidence from the poor. And why? That's very basic understanding. A lot of poor people don't have money. You don't have money to build monuments that last. You don't have money to build this and that. I mean, if you're, I've referred many times, and I'll probably keep referring to that show on the History Channel from years ago that I think they brought back, where it was like a life on Earth without humans, where it was just like, what if we instantaneously vanished, and what would happen to the Earth? Well, it was so interesting because after 100 years, pretty much the only thing that's left is stone. After 1,000 years, definitely the only thing that's left in stone. And the monuments at Mount Rushmore are withered to half of nothing. So imagine 2,000 years ago with the ancient Romans. I mean, continue on from that. What about 3,000 years ago? And the ancient Egyptians were a few hundred years out of their having the Israelites as their slaves. What about that? And then there's the controversial view that they weren't really slaves; they were set to labor and all these different things. But what's kind of the difference between set to labor and forced to labor? I mean, it's kind of the same thing. But it's really interesting because the Israelites were originally the protectors of Egypt in the northern border. And then they had they were so good at their job that they defended the northern border well, and there was no more incursions into the northern border. And so the Egyptians were like, great, well, now this rival warlord force of Israelites are doing all this stuff, and now they might try to assassinate me or take power from my throne or something like that. And it's like, so they said, oh, well, we'll commission them to do this job, and then we'll force them into the job if they don't want to keep doing it. And then eventually 400 years go by until you get to the time of Moses. So it's like, and we know that this actually happened. It's not just biblical text. So, but what if, here's the opposite thing. What if they didn't set the Israelites to labor? What if they just kept them employed? What if they said, all right, instead of you being a defensive force, what if we make you an offensive force? Time to go conquer some more lands. What would have happened then? Would the Israelites identify as what would now become Jewish, or would later become Jewish, I should say? And then would the Egyptians eventually over the years adopt the Israelite religion? Because it's interesting. Remember, the Israelites and Abraham come out of the city of Ur, or near the city of Ur, in the Sumerian Empire, who believed in the polytheistic gods of the Anunnaki. And what's interesting too is that one of the Anunnaki gods, one of the Egyptian gods, and one of the Israelite god are really all seem to be the same person. And so it would make sense that if given long-term exposure to the Israelite religion, they might say, hey, your all creator God, Yahweh, sounds just like our all creator God of Osiris. So it would make sense that they would adopt it. And then it was interesting how, and you know what else is interesting too, is the Egyptians, the Romans would go and they were very tolerable of other religions. In fact, in many times, they would go and conquer your land and then incorporate your gods into the Roman pantheon of gods. But what's interesting is they didn't do that with the Jewish God. They didn't do that with the Israelite God. Why? What if they did decide to do that? For example, what if they decided to go in? Would the Israelites have become more Roman more willingly? Would there ever have been a need for a character like Jesus to rise? Because while we look at Jesus as being a religious person, Jesus was ever more a political figure, especially in the time when it is a mistake, a historical and a religious mistake, to view Jesus's acts in the Capitol, in the temple, right before he died, as not a political act. It is a mistake to not view it as a political act. It is definitely a political act. And many historians have also pointed out that his change in the perception of the Messiah from being a warrior king to a almost prophet is another political statement. It is a political statement against the establishment of the Jewish authorities, the Israelite authorities at the time. I say Jewish because later on they would become wait a minute. No, right before this, they start to become the Jewish tribe and everything from the tribe of Judea and all of that. Right before this is when those times start to happen with Solomon and all of that. And excuse me, a few hundred years before that. And the so you start to have this these change in ideas and this establishment of the Jewish authorities, the Israelite authorities, their priesthood class, who were the ones who were going against Jesus. So he's making a political statement in this. And he's making a political statement by overturning the money changers and doing all these other things. So if you had the Israelite religion incorporated into the Roman Empire and become a pantheon, because if you think about it, the Romans could have simply said, "Oh, you're supreme all creator God? Sounds just like our god Jupiter. Yeah, bring him in." Same thing. Just the only thing is when you come into the city of Rome, make sure you refer to him as Jupiter. It's the same thing. In fact, they probably would have done that anyway, because when you go into Rome, nobody there is speaking the Israelite language. Nobody. So you're not going to say, oh, the we're going to go there and I'm going to speak to you in Latin or Greek, and then I'm going to say in Hebrew our name, our God's name. You might do that, but then they would say, "I'm sorry, can you translate for us? I don't understand what that means." And then they would probably say like Jupiter or something because it's the supreme God or something like that, And then you could also say that maybe they wouldn't, because it would be like how today in our modern languages, like let's say for like Japanese or something, when there's, or Italian even also, when there's no translation from English to that language, you just say the English word. It's a say you do that in Italian, we do that in some Japanese words, and and I'm sure they do it in many other languages. But those are the two that I know of for definite. So, it's, what if they had done that? Would there have been a political need for Jesus? And then if Jesus did come about, would he have been seen as a prophet, a true prophet, like in the terms of Samuel and Elijah and these other prophets? And so would he have been seen in that long line of prophets instead? Who knows? Because we know that Islam sees him as a prophet, or one of the prophet peoples. The Ethiopians see him as a prophet. They don't see him as the son of God like the Christians do, but they see him as a prophet. And in a way, would the Jews, the Israelites, have seen him as a prophet also, if the need for the political statement wasn't there? What if Herod the Great wasn't put into power, and Herod Antipas come after him? Because even though, it's interesting, we read today that Herod the Great was hated, especially in the Bible. You know that when Jesus was born, he issued that all the firstborn sons be killed. But what if Herod the Great didn't need to do that? And because he may have actually done that, because we know he was, kind of crazy, but he was also loved by the people. He restored and grandized the Temple of Solomon, the same temple that Jesus later overturns the tables of the money changers. So, what if Herod didn't care about that, and Jesus didn't need to make a political statement against him? There's also that great quote in the Bible where Jesus, they try to trick him. The priesthood tries to trick him and say, "Well, should you pay taxes?" And Jesus says, "Why are you trying to trick me? Bring me a coin." And he says, "Whose face do you see on this coin?" And they say, "The emperor." And he says, "So give to the emperor what belongs to the emperor, and give to God what belongs to God." And today, that's a very quoted statement, especially on people who believe in the religion and do all these other things. But it's a very quoted statement these days, because especially today in our American society, where we try to keep, although today in our current politics, religion has kind of taken a strong stance with everything, but we try to keep religion separate. And so when you try to keep it separate, we wouldn't see those things as being together, but you would still see that quote as being relevant because it shows the separation of church and state. It shows how Jesus wanted the separation of church and state because he said, listen, I'm not here to, people interpret that, historians interpret that as saying, listen, I'm not here to rebel against Caesar. He wants my taxes, give him my taxes. But at the end of the day, I'm going to pray to Yahweh. I'm going to pray to our God, the Israelite God, the God of Abraham. So it's really interesting how, what if the Romans had incorporated the Israelite God the same way that they incorporated the Etruscan gods and the Greek gods and other gods, over the years. And sometimes they even incorporated the Gaelic gods later on after Julius Caesar's conquering of Gaul. They would do the same thing. So it's really interesting. By the way, I want more of my coffee.
Zeus! Zeus!
I am Zeus. Yes, thank you for noticing. Zeus. Good coffee. I always say it, but I'm like that guy from Pulp Fiction. He's like, don't tell me how good the coffee is. All right? I know how good the fucking coffee is because I buy it. It's like, that's me, bro. Oh my God. The coffee is so freaking good, man. So, it's really interesting. So, back to the beginning. About 15 episodes ago, too, we talked about the episode is titled Romulus. So, what's up, Famistral? What the hell? Famistral? Are you like astral projecting your textualized self? Uh, uh, Famistral? Famistral. How are you? Great. How are you? Bro. So, so we had 15 episodes famished. Yeah. But that's not what it says now. Who that? I don't know. Who the hell is that? So anyway, Famistral, what up, bruh? For sure it did. What up, yo? Chilling, man. It's chilling. We are so chilling. But 15 episodes ago we had Romulus, and now today we're talking about Remus. And it also reminds me of that episode we talked about where there was many cultures about the twins and the twin brothers. My mission failed. And so the you're astral projecting. So the interesting thing is many people look at, I mentioned before, Alexander the Great. The Romans emulized Alexander the Great, even though he was Greek. And then when they viewed him as one of the gods in the pantheon of gods, same thing with Julius Caesar. And it was interesting because today, especially in this book I was listening to, they forget the idea that today we do the same thing that the Romans did. The Romans viewed a person and they said this person was so great. They did great things. They were awesome. They were strong. They conquered. They did great things for the people. So what they would do is they would get together and everybody would say this person has become a god after they died. Because they were so great in life, that after death they must only be a god. And so they would deify a person. Today in Christianity, we do the same thing. We just call it giving them sainthood. What's the difference? You're still making them a deity in some retrospect, but it's a sainthood. And so it's the same exact thing. Today in our modern culture, we do maybe I guess it's not exactly a one-to-one relationship, but we have celebrity culture and celebrity worship. People worship celebrities like they did the gods. Believe me, that is a fact. So, just take that into equation. But it's still not a one-to-one relationship. But it is a one-to-one relationship between deifying a person in ancient Rome and making them a saint in today's modern terms. So, that being said, when you look and you look at it and you say, okay, Julius Caesar was deified and so was Augustus, it makes sense because they were so great in their lifetime and the people loved them. We forget that Julius Caesar was hated by the Senate and loved by the people. So much so that after the Senate murdered him, the people rebelled and there was almost 20 years of civil war until Octavian became the emperor and the ruler, which is interesting because even though today we look back at as Augustus and Octavian becoming Augustus, becoming the first emperor, Augustus was not the emperor when he ruled. He was what they called the first citizen, the ruler. And he used the Senate. He basically was a one-man ruler, what we today would term an emperor. He was an autocrat for sure, but they didn't use the title emperor like the later Roman emperors did. It wasn't the same thing, you know. So it wasn't the same sort of terms. Later on in Roman history, while Rome was still Rome, they definitely called Augustus the emperor, the first emperor. Because remember, Julius Caesar wasn't an emperor, he was a dictator. There's a very big difference because a dictator is somebody who just dictates policy and does whatever they want, without fail and without anybody telling them that they can't do it. That's what a dictator is. An emperor is different. An emperor might have dictatorial powers, but it's a little different. So the dictator, though, is Julius Caesar wanted to do a lot of things. Remember, Julius Caesar what if they didn't kill Julius Caesar? Julius Caesar was on his way to go and meet his soldiers on the battlefront where they were about to go invade and conquer a new territory. And he got convinced by Brutus, who he was mentoring and mentored his whole life, to stay for the Senate meeting that they eventually killed him at. And it was interesting because, it was only like a few senators out of the hundreds of them that were in there. It was only a few senators who took part in this. And some of them, it was an epic butchery failure because some of them, Julius Caesar, being the epic soldier that he was, dodged and fought back. He fought back and was literally gone, and he only started failing in his fight back of his life when they stabbed him in the lower spine and he fell and collapsed to the ground, and then they kept stabbing him. Before that, he actually, there's the record that he actually dodged one of the stab thrusts, and the stab thrust landed in the thigh of one of the other assailants. So he literally, like, imagine Batman, like parrying a blow, and the guy actually stabs the other guy behind him. They've done that in Batman cartoons and animations, so I have no doubt that they would do that in that they would do that. He could do that in real life. I mean, Julius Caesar was an epic warrior during his times. Also a crazy murderer, but an epic warrior at the same time. You got to remember too, the times were different. Conquering people, the concept of murder in that sort of fashion is not really what they thought of. There was no concept of Julius Caesar going out there and killing all those thousands of people as being a murder. It wasn't really a concept. And even when the senators tried to declare Julius Caesar as a rebel, they didn't give a shit that he murdered all those Gauls out there. They just gave a shit that he did it without them telling him that he could do it. That's what the problem was, that he was a dictator before he was a dictator. He was doing whatever he wanted. That's what they had the problem with. They didn't care at all that he was killing all those thousands of people. They didn't give a shit. That's just how it was. They had a different perspective on life and everything that we do. And you got to remember too, our Western perspective on life has been shaped by Christianity and everything for 2,000 years. Whether you're a Christian or not, your life has been shaped by Christianity for 2,000 years. That is a fact. No matter who you are. Coffee. There's a fuzz on my earbud and it's itching my inner ear. I have to get it off. It's terrible. You ever get that? Oh my god. I bought these earbud cleaners and it's dope. We'll clean them after. There's a fuzz in my ear. Oh my god. Um so anyway, it's really interesting to view it like that because um you would, by the way, if you haven't gone and liked that X post, I would appreciate if you did. I don't know why doesn't it post? It's supposed to post it on Kick too. Why doesn't it do that? Here you go, Kick. I don't understand why it doesn't automatically post it to Kick, because it's supposed to automatically post it to Kick also. So I don't get it. But anyway, yeah, if you could go like that'd be awesome. I always post everything on X. We're WARRmultiverse all the way around. WARR multiverse, all one word. Um, I'm still getting over that sickness from weeks ago. I realized that I never say what our profile is. Like I know it's written around everywhere, but I never verbally say it on the podcast. It's WARRmultiverse with 2 R's, all one word, on all platforms. And if you go on there and you don't find us on that platform, we're not on that platform. We're not on Blue Sky. We're not on Instagram. I don't know, whatever other platform that you could think of that you're not finding me on, we're not on it. YouTube, we're on. X, we're on. Facebook, Kick, Twitch, some podcast, Audible. As the podcast, we're on Audible, Amazon Music, Apple Music, YouTube, Spotify, Ghana, few others. There's so many. We're on all the way out there. Google Podcast doesn't even exist anymore. So anyway, back to our conversation. So, oh, by the way, updates on our streaming setup. So, I'm really focused on, now that our website is fully updated, I'm fully focused on finishing the books, or at least the first one. I'm fully focused on only the first one, I should say. If you go to the website, there's 3 things that are being worked on under projects, and the first one that's there is what I'm talking about. That's what we're working on, the novel. We're working on the novel. I'm really focused on it. But also, I'm really busy and I'm trying to live life and stuff. So, um, I'm gonna try and just go live for not the podcast whenever I'm just whenever I'm just playing games at home at night or something like that. So it'll be like, 2.5 hours of games, and that's about it. On a whatever night that it is that I'm not busy or not working or something. So that's the way it's going to be. So there's no more set game schedule for streaming. We are going to do the podcast and still stream it on Saturdays, of course. But beyond that, there's no set schedule anymore, at least until like May of 2026. For sure. Like, no doubt. But that's the way it is because that's the way life is. It's awesome. Life is awesome, man. Life is fantastic. So, back to our conversation. So what if the opposite didn't happen? What if, let's go back to Alexander the Great for a second. Alexander the Great, what if he listened to his generals and didn't go into India? Didn't contract his disease, went back and shored up his lands, shored up his government, made everything perfect. Because it was only about 100 years later, that it kept on, that part of the Romans really started conquering things. But it was interesting because many historians, and this book talked about it a lot too. And so I found it really intriguing. Many historians look at what if Alexander the Great had gone the other direction and instead of going towards India, had turned his forces on Rome? What if he was the one who conquered Rome and Italy instead of the Romans eventually conquering the Greeks? What if he was the one who did that? It's really interesting because most historians think that Alexander the Great would have lost. Because Alexander the Great had a huge army, but his army was mostly a guerrilla tactic, not really a hit and run force. They could sustain a long battle, but like they would get tired on these long campaigns. I'm looking for a lack of better description on how to describe it. They would they weren't meant for long campaigns. They were really good at just coming out of nowhere and being like this tidal force of conquering, almost like how later on with the German Blitzkrieg in World War II, they would just lightning quick, just come in, conquer, and move and move and move. And that's what they did. And that's why when he died, his empire fell apart because he didn't stay in one area and establish government and then move on. He just conquered, moved on, conquered, moved on, conquered, moved on. And so he didn't have a sustained military force and a sustained government. Whereas the Romans, they had thousands of soldiers and thousands of civilians that they could just keep on calling up, keep on going. And the regular civilians were very well trained at the time. They were not just regular run-of-the-mill people. If you owned land, you were expected to be part of the military. If you were a citizen, eventually you would also be expected to be part of the military. In the early years of Rome, it was only landowners who were allowed to be in the military. But when they needed more soldiers, it eventually extended to citizens. So the idea is that Alexander the Great would have lost to the Romans because the Romans could just keep on coming. No matter what they did, no matter how you beat them back, there was always more soldiers to fight. And what's interesting, comparatively, in our modern times, they said the same thing about the Americans in World War II. But no matter what would have happened, the Germans never would have won the war in the long run. Because when we got to the end of 1944 and the war in 1945, at the end, they were using old and young soldiers, all like almost young boys, because they were running out of their highly trained troops. And they couldn't keep re-upping the troops. Everywhere they conquered, they started enslaving people and killing people and doing all these things. They didn't continuously shore up the troops. The Americans, no matter how many Americans you killed, we could just keep coming and coming and coming like a tsunami, whereas Alexander the Great was like a lightning blitzkrieg. The Romans were like a tsunami that just kept on coming. And to put it to a visual description for your brain, a tsunami, you picture a giant wave coming and just slamming over shit. But that's not what a tsunami is. Tsunami is like multiple ripples of waves coming in that just stacks on top of each other like a sandwich. So it's like this wave comes and then the next wave and then the next wave and the next wave until it all just pushes forward and conquers everything around it, in its path. It's not like one big wave. That would be like a rogue wave or something in the middle of the ocean. Or a tidal wave. That might be one giant wave, but a giant tsunami being one big wave, that's not what a tsunami is. And so to put it to the imagination, the Romans could just keep coming, keep adding more and more troops and more layers. So from that perspective, historians think that Alexander the Great would have lost. So what if he did turn the other way? What if he did lose? Well, in this case, the Romans would have just conquered Greece 100 and maybe 20 years earlier. Big deal. So but how would that have changed? See, that might have changed the Romans earlier on because the Romans, once they conquered Greece, had more access to Greek text and philosophy and their perspective on things. And they would read the text and they would, go have the oracles and all of that with the same similar gods and everything. But they had access to this now, and they had access to the writings of the Greek philosophers. And the Greek philosophers were very influential on the Romans. So what if they had conquered them 120 years earlier? Would somebody like Julius Caesar have even come around, or Augustus have even come around, because they were, more philosophical and less warlike by this time? Or would they have become more like the Japanese samurai later on, where they were extreme, verbose warriors, and yet at the same time they were artisans and poets and writers and orators and all these beautiful poetic artistic things? What if the Romans became exactly like that? How would Rome look different? It would look very different. You would have artistic culture being the norm over military culture many years later. And what's interesting, because that's what happened in Japan, and then if you look at Japan, they keep going back and forth from the artistic and the military culture. It might have been the same thing in Rome. We know that the Romans viewed art and history and philosophical writings very strongly, and they loved it and they viewed it as part of the culture and all these different things. What if um it had affected Roman culture way earlier on, and this type of thing would have definitely changed them for sure, no doubt about it. So what if they had changed everything? Roman culture would be so different. Again, there might not have been a need for a Jesus. Or if there was a Jesus, maybe he would have been more like how the traditional Israelites and Jews viewed the Messiah, a warrior priest. What if Jesus would have been the same way? Maybe if he had grown up in that Roman culture of art and war all at the same time, maybe he would have been the same way. He would have embraced that and eventually led the people into an actual rebellion and been the actual Messiah that the Israelites thought of since before the time of Moses. So, what if that had been the norm? Again, how would the world look? For we might not have, in fact, we definitely wouldn't have Christianity at all. If anything, the people who would become Christians might become Jews eventually. They might do all these other things. They might become something other than what they did become now in our lifetime. So it's really interesting. What if, all the way back to the title of our episode, what if Remus had killed Romulus instead of Romulus killing Remus? What would have happened then? Would the Romans, first of all, wouldn't be the Romans. Or maybe he would have named the city Rome after his brother and played it off as like his brother died of some illness or something and he was beloved, and maybe he would have become the first deity of them. Maybe they would be a culture who revered their ancestors instead of a culture that revered the gods. Like the Incans, for example, down in South America, and there's another culture in South America. What was their name? Um they view their ancestors as more than as deities, more than they view the actual gods. And what's interesting about that too is when the Christians came to South America, to these people's lands, and forced their religion onto them, they actually just adopted it. And today they do the same exact ceremony. They used to do, oh my God, I'm forgetting the name of God. I would love to remember the name off the top of my head. So the these people would do this festival where they would take out the mummies of their dead and they would parade them around, clean them, wash them, worship them, whatever, have dinners and stuff, and then they would put them back. And today, they do the exact same ceremony, but instead of taking out the mummies of their dead, the dead ancestors, they parade around the statues of the Christian saints. Super interesting, because when the Christians came, they did not view Christianity the same way that the missionaries were forcing it upon them. They looked at it and said, oh, this is a saint and he was a real person and you knew who he was, and now we have a statue of him. So what you're saying is he was one of your ancestors. So it's the same thing. So they literally looked at the Christian tradition as being just like their ancestor worship. They did the exact same thing. And so it was kind of interesting that they were just like, yeah, okay, no problem. We'll just worship these statues or whatever instead of your thing. There's no worries. You don't need to kill us. And of course, they did kill some of them, but it was less of a massacre than other areas in the world. And today they still do the same uh, thing. On this they march around on this in this parade route that they have, and they carry the same statues around the same way that they did hundreds if not thousands of years ago with their ancestors. It's just that instead of a human mummy, it's a porcelain statue or whatever it's made out of. Stone, marble, whatever you make the statue out of. I don't know. Coffee time. Coffee is freaking great. So by the way, I like all appreciate y'all with those likes on that X post. That's awesome. And so anyway, so um what if the culture would have been, how different would the culture have been? Because it's really interesting because there's not a lot of talk about Remus in ancient Rome and in text. First of all, the Romans didn't really go back and look at their history until hundreds of years later, like 300-400 years into their culture. So there was no like accurate timekeeping and record keeping. And this is also interesting because it makes many historians believe that the story of Romulus and Remus is actually a bunch of malarkey. That it may just be a made up concept that was it could just be a made up concept that was given to them by later historians in order to try and have an origin story for the Romans. In reality, what it was is there was a bunch of tribes and small cities that were ruled by a king or a kingdom, and they would go and the Romans were another small city, and they would go and conquer areas. And when they conquered those areas, they incorporated those people into their culture and into their army. And then they would go and conquer another area. This is where we get the Battle of Mithridates and other people that we get in the story of the Etruscans. When you hear about the Italians and the Etruscans, who were the precursors to the Romans, the Etruscans were. Well, it's not necessarily true. It is true, but it isn't true. The Etruscans were like another city, another tribal area on the Italian peninsula, just like all these other things were that were eventually conquered by Rome, and their pantheon of gods were incorporated into the Roman pantheon. And they would just do this and do this and do this all the way until you get to the time of Julius Caesar, right before he starts to continue to expand the empire into the region of Gaul and Northern Europe. So, um, in so this perspective of it as being the Etruscans as being their you know direct progenitors is not really accurate. They were a area, but it's true in a way, because also because the Romans would incorporate these people into their culture. So, and what they would do also is Rome would allow people to come to their city to run away and seek asylum. So in the beginning of Roman culture, there was this I don't know what to call it. There was this hatred, I guess. I don't know a better word for it, of the original Romans because they were looked at the same way we would look at today. It's almost like an American comparison. America is just a bunch of people of immigrants. While the Romans in their beginning times were really kind of a city of immigrants, asylum seekers. That's the word I was looking for. They were people who were running away from their city and would seek asylum in Rome. They may have been a criminal, did something else, but the Romans welcomed them in as long as they gave up their whatever and adopted the Roman way of life and joined the army. And so they would go from area to area doing this. So many people from the Etruscan cities, if there was more than one, I don't specifically remember off the top of my head, some of them would leave there and come to Rome, seeking asylum, a new way of life. Whatever reason people immigrate and migrate from areas to areas. It's the same thing 2,000 years ago as today. They do it for many reasons. Better life, better employment, good for their family, yada yada. So it's really interesting also how when you look at their incorporation of other cultures, because it's almost the same. It's interesting how our founding fathers in America look back at the Romans for inspiration, and we were doing the same thing. We were a new culture telling people, hey, come here, come be a part of us and fight for us. And in exchange, you can have all this land and wealth and land of opportunity and all this other stuff. Come immigrate to us. We're a culture of immigrants. It was the same thing for the early Romans, except on a smaller scale. It wasn't a whole continent. It was just, a city on a peninsula. So, it was really interesting. What if they didn't do that? What if instead of doing that, they would go and, they would just shun everybody away? That we are Romans and we're Romans for Rome and only Rome. What if they did that? They wouldn't have grown to be the biggest military conqueror. Alexander the Great would have came to Rome and conquered in 4 seconds if he had turned the other way around, because they didn't have that tidal wave of forces that we talked about a few minutes ago. They didn't have that tsunami of forces. So it's when you put it into a perspective like that, it's almost mind blowing. And other things too. What if Julius Caesar wasn't killed? Rome might not have become an empire. See, there's an interesting thing is adoption in Rome wasn't as controversial as it was in America for the past around 50 to 100 years. And back then, it was just something you did. It was something you did to ensure your land. And especially if you didn't have any children to inherit your property, you would need to adopt somebody to inherit your property. And controversially, it wasn't uncommon to leave your property to your daughter, and your daughter had the rights to your property, especially if you didn't have a male heir. But you could also choose to leave it to your daughter. You didn't have to leave it to your son. It wasn't a requirement, even though it was a patriarchal society. Especially, it only really mostly became a dominantly patriarchal society in the later years. Like 100 years before Julius Caesar, I would say. It became a more dominant patriarchal society. But women still had many rights. including the right to land ownership, whether they were married or not, was part of the rules with it. So, so it wasn't uncommon for Julius Caesar to adopt his nephew Octavian. It wasn't uncommon for him to do things. And, it wasn't uncommon for these people to also have mistresses and many girlfriends and lovers and all these things. It wasn't uncommon at all. Brutus, who ended up killing Julius Caesar and conspiring against him, Brutus was a very interesting character because Brutus is the son of Julius Caesar's mistress. Brutus's father was killed years earlier in one of the civil wars going on in Rome in the early years before Julius Caesar came to power. And he was too young to adopt his father's senatorialship, and the mother couldn't be a senator. So their family kind of didn't really have senatorial representation for a few decades. But Julius Caesar was the lover of his mother. She was his mistress. And he eventually, maybe at the behest of his mistress, maybe not, he eventually took Brutus under his wing and began to mentor him. And many historians look back and see that if Julius Caesar did not leave Brutus to fend for himself in Rome, Brutus never would have betrayed Caesar. Very interesting perspective, because Caesar goes off to Gaul for years, and in Germania, and kills hundreds of thousands of people. Thousands of people. And leaves Brutus, who's now like 18 years old, to fend for himself in the Senate. And Julius Caesar didn't do this without like being a dick. He had mentored the kid for at least a decade. He figured the kid should have been able to handle himself, especially because when he first came into power, Julius Caesar was in the Senate. He was a consul. He was one of the co-consuls that ruled before he started his Gallic campaigns. So Brutus did have that mentorship in the beginning of him coming in. But Brutus was also a weak person and very prone to corruption. There's the famous story that we know that Brutus, in one of the territories he was given governorship over, was trying to charge 48% interest on loans he lent out and everything, which at the time was illegal and in Roman culture. So he was a crook. So Brutus was prone to crookery. And is that even a word? And was prone to doing all these bad things. And he was prone to being influenced by other people and all this crap. So, you look at him and you say, well, it makes sense that he would have done that. In fact, if you look at it, if he stayed the way he is and Julius Caesar stayed there, he might have still done the same thing. But Julius Caesar never wanted to be a dictator. He never planned on being a dictator. But when he went and left his people, and I'm sorry, when he was declared an enemy of the state by the Senate and Pompey, that is when everything changed for Julius Caesar. Because right then and there, he thought he was winning Gaul for the glory of Rome. And he even writes it down as such. And when they declared him an enemy of the state, Julius Caesar was hurt. Unfortunately for them, the Senate did not calculate the level of loyalty that his soldiers had for him. But not only that, they didn't calculate the fact that Rome did not have a standing state-run military until Augustus came into power. Because before that, you had single generals rising to prominence and raising their own militaries. And Julius Caesar was one of these generals who raised their own military and went off and conquered for the glory of Rome. So when he was declared an enemy of the state, and hold up, and these people, these soldiers, were directly dependent on their generals for retirement benefits, for their land, for protection, and for their pay. The Senate did not pay these people. So when the Senate declared Julius Caesar an enemy of the state, they were effectively also declaring every single one of his troops an enemy of the state as well. So when Julius Caesar was declared an enemy, he rightfully turned to his men and said, "We are all enemies now." And they said, "Yes, we are." And they went and marched on to Rome. And what's interesting too is Julius Caesar, during his time, was not always ruling in Rome. He was off on a lot of campaigns. He spent many years in Egypt. He spent many years all around the world before he even came back to Rome after Pompey was dead already. So Pompey died, and he spent like 2 years in Egypt, another 2 years somewhere else, and then came back to Rome to shore up his power there. He didn't actually want to be a dictator, but it's only now in our modern perspectives, and we also view dictator differently in our modern perspectives because we have examples from history of bad people like Hitler, and even the guy who Dracula is named after now. So I'll let you look who that is. I'll let you look into who that is. So the guy who Dracula is named after, I'll just say it, it's Vlad the Impaler. Vlad the Impaler is the historical person who the idea of Dracula comes from. Vlad the Impaler would impale people on stakes and all these other things. So you knew that it was him doing this. So that's exactly what he did. Oh yeah, I appreciate that. With those likes on the post. So that's exactly what happened. So what if the Senate did not declare Julius Caesar and his troops an enemy of Rome? What if they embraced him as a hero and declared him consul for another year? Because remember, consulship only lasted 1 year. So what if they declared him consul for another year when he came back to Rome and didn't kill him? What if he did all of that? Well, the Roman Empire would look different. He, at the time, was in his mid to late 40s, early 50s, somewhere between 44 and 52 years old. He probably could have lived for another 20 years. For all you know, and all we know, is he might not even come back to Rome. He might have even fully shored up the people of Gaul and conquered them and fully adapted them into the Roman way, and then conquered Britannia instead of just having the one expedition into the island of Brittany. What if he came and did all of that and conquered that area, and then came back at 62 years old and ruled as a consul for 1 year and then died? How would the Roman world and our modern world will look different? It would look so different. Because you wouldn't have had the 20 years of civil war. You wouldn't have had the 8 years of civil war between Pompey and the senators and Julius Caesar, and then followed by 20 more years of civil war after his death. you wouldn't have had all of that. There may have been another war, there may have been a rebellion for sure with somebody else or something else, but you wouldn't have had that war that changed everything and made Augustus into the first emperor, or what would become the first emperor. So it's really interesting because Julius Caesar believed in the Roman way of life. He believed in the Senate and all these things, and he just believed that the Senate at that time was corrupt, and it was corrupt. It was very well known that taking bribes as a senator was not not written in the law, but it was customary to do so. You If you were going to be a senator, people were paying you and bribing you, and that's the way it is. In fact, when you would some people, some senators, when they were elected consul, they would go in, and when they would argue against their opponent, and they would have obviously different points of view from their opponent, different laws that they wanted to pass. When they would win, as a measure of mutual respect and gratification, and quote unquote back to business, the new elected consul would pass a couple of the laws that his rival wanted to have passed in order for him to come in and prevent any sort of rebellion or sort of thing. He would say, all right, listen, our race is over. I won. Take your seat back at the Senate. Tell me what laws you wanted passed. We'll talk about it. We'll get it done. That's what they did at the time. Not every senator did that, but it was very customary to do that when you became consul in the early years of the Roman Republic. And Julius Caesar thought the same thing. He was very custom. And I point to the fact that when Pompey was murdered by the Egyptians on the opposite side of Cleopatra, and Julius Caesar is reported by multiple accounts to have wept for Pompey. And there was the rule that in the Senate, you didn't kill the senators. It was beneath them to kill each other. You would argue and make rules and connive against and conspire against each other, but kill each other, that was beneath you. That you didn't think that. So when the Egyptians didn't think like that. So when the Egyptians came and killed Pompey, Julius Caesar wept. And some historians look back as that being the reason why he supported Cleopatra instead of her brother, because Cleopatra was not the one who they thought would have taken the throne. But Cleopatra's brother was the younger brother. So when Cleopatra and her brother's father died as the pharaoh, which wasn't even called the pharaoh in ancient Egypt, by the way. They were that was later on historians calling them the pharaoh. But they were just the king, whatever the king was called in Egyptian, but it wasn't pharaoh. And I forgot what it was. And so they would look, and she was not the intended heir, but the younger brother was the intended heir, but because he was so young, the father elected them both. And so did the ruling council of the Egyptians, because even though they had a king, the king also had a council. And when the king died early and didn't have an old enough heir, they voted to make sure that Cleopatra would be the co-pharaoh. Except that the younger brother was reportedly just he was unable to be dealt with. He was just so horrible for people to even be around that they couldn't even talk to him. He would just yell and scream and dictate at everybody like a pompous asshole. So he would do all those things. So for Julius Caesar, who was very civilized and had customs in his society, Cleopatra would have been the natural choice, especially because, like I said a few minutes ago, it was not uncommon for a woman in Rome to take a a to take a lead role to become an heir to a ship of whatever, um, uh, a land, to become the heir of even a throne. It was not common, but it wasn't uncommon either. That's the key, really. It wasn't uncommon either. They would it was very uncommon, extremely rare for it to be somebody of a throne, of a rulership, of course, but to be an heir to a land or somebody else's powers or something was not uncommon. But the woman still couldn't be a senator. So it was not, it was very common for Cleopatra. It was very obvious to Julius Caesar for Cleopatra to be the obvious choice. But what if we go and say she wasn't? What if we say the opposite of history happened? She was terrible, and Julius Caesar decided to back the brother. What if the brother wasn't a pompous ass, and Julius Caesar said, yeah, okay, we'll back you, killed off Cleopatra, did all these things, and then Egypt became a Roman province, and Julius Caesar was not only seen as the conqueror of Gaul, but the conqueror of Egypt? And what if he, like Alexander the Great, was named a pharaoh of Egypt? Remember, they weren't called pharaohs, though. But what if he was named the ruler of Egypt? What if he died in Rome and his body was taken to Egypt to be mummified and buried just like Alexander the Great's body was? What if it was the same sort of thing? What if the same thing happened to Julius? It would have been a very different world because Egypt wouldn't have been a province. The Egyptian gods would have been incorporated into the Roman pantheon of gods and they would have been taken over. Then, what would have happened to the Israelites and the Jews? Because remember, the Jews fled from Egypt. Would the Jews have been totally conquered by the Romans? Maybe not even have maybe either in a way that they had their gods, their God be incorporated into the Roman gods, or, like what if they had it being incorporated into their pantheon? Or what if they had conquered them completely, wiped them out, wiped out their, you know, belief in their God and their temple, didn't tolerate them for even a minute because of the Egyptian heritage connection, and forced them to either convert or die? What would have happened then? Well, I'll tell you this. There would have been none of the Jewish wars. There would be no rebellion of Solomon. Might not even be a Jesus. Or would Jesus have come and been another version of Moses? Or somebody like Jesus have come and been another version of Moses, where maybe the Israelites were in slavery or servitude of the Romans instead of the Egyptians, and another Moses type figure comes in, maybe Jesus, maybe somebody else, and leads them out of slavery and bondage from the Romans. We would have a totally different Israelite religion today as well. Because not only would we have the celebration of the story of the release from bondage from Egypt, but we would have the story of the celebration of the release of bondage from the Romans, the Israelites' religion. And not only that, but you might think that many Romans, instead of converting to Christianity in later centuries, might have converted to Judaism and to the Israelite religion of the time, because their God, their single God, had beaten the Romans. That means that their God had also beaten the Roman gods. So how could the Romans consider themselves to be superior and superior to all other gods of religions if they had just gotten beat by the Israelites? How could that be possible? And the answer is it wouldn't be possible. So they would look at the Jewish religion, the Israelite religion, and say, that God is greater than our gods. Let's go worship him. And that's exactly what they would do, 100%, no doubt about it. They would have totally converted to the Israelite religion. I don't even know if they had a conversion then, but they would have done something, and so it would have been totally different. The world would be different. Maybe there wouldn't be Christians and Catholics at all. Instead, we would all be some sort of Jewish or Israelite version of that religion, and maybe like I said before, it would have been Jesus who came and he would have been the Messiah, but in the traditional Israelite version of the Messiah as a warrior priest. Maybe because, we look at Jesus as being the Messiah, but in reality, Moses was the Messiah. Moses was the warrior priest. What are you talking about? He was trained to be a warrior by the Egyptian kingdom and the Pharaoh and everything. He was the adopted son of the Pharaoh's daughter. He was the adopted grandson of the Pharaoh. I mean, it was literally, he was trained by the best, educated by the best. So when he went to Egypt and knew the Jewish religion and spoke to Yahweh at the mountain and all these things, he also knew everything there was to know about the Egyptian religion and the Egyptian beliefs and their priesthood and their warfare and way of fighting. So he did know all those things, and he was a warrior. And to drive the point home, after the Israelites had left Egypt and they fought their first battle, Moses realized that my people are not ready. And they went into the desert and lived in the desert for 40 years. Okay, you got to remember, Moses at the end of this time is like, by the time Joshua becomes the next one, Moses is like 90 years old. Okay? Because you got to remember the time frame. Moses is a baby sent down the river, and the daughter of the Pharaoh finds her. She's like 16, right? Takes the baby, says, I want this baby. I'm keeping it. Bless it. I'm adopting it, right? Adopts the baby. And remember, the baby is passed down because the Pharaoh had ordered the killing of the children. So this is one of the many times that the firstborns are killed throughout biblical history. And Moses comes in and is raised up, and by the time he's like 16, 18, they tell him the truth about his parentage, and he flees Egypt. Lives in the desert for 40 years. Okay. And at the time, he goes and meets with other tribes and all these things, but he's wandering for 40 years. So now he's like 16, 18. So we'll say he's 56 years old by the time he comes back to Egypt and literally tries to free the slaves. Then he frees them, travels into the desert, and they all go and live in the desert for 40 more years, the Bible says. So by the time they go to leave, Moses is like 90-something years old. So when historical people read the Bible and they say, what happened to Moses? It just says that, God said he couldn't enter the kingdom. Well, two things might have happened. Many military historians, and I spoke about this before in previous episodes, many military historians think that Moses might have been assassinated by his men. Entirely possible. Moses was a ruthless dictator who had no problem killing people, for sure. The Bible says pretty much all that in not so many words. But he said he pretty much was. So the people might have had enough. They might have had enough of all the death. Or he was probably 96, 98 years old at the time, if not older. He could have just died of old age. I mean, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that that was a long time to live in those days. People lived a decent life, but 96, 98, that was long. That was very, very long in those days. So, he could have just died of old age. We don't know, but we'll find out eventually, I'm sure. Maybe we'll find some archaeological historical record written in Egyptian culture or whatever. Because remember, some historians think that he might have actually gone back to Egypt. He was the adopted brother of a pharaoh, the adopted daughter of the pharaoh's daughter, the adopted grandson of a pharaoh, the adopted cousin of another pharaoh. Moses was Egyptian through and through. And so he might have gone back to Egypt to be died, or had some of his men carry him back to Egypt to be embalmed. We don't know, but it might have been true. And for example of this, there is an inscription on one of the Egyptian tombs that says, "Here lies Tutmosis." And historians have pointed that there might be a connection between King Tutankhamun and Moses. Moses might have been the adopted cousin of Tutankhamun. Possible. We don't know for sure, but it's one connection that some scientists, some historians and archaeologists have made. It's entirely possible, and when I viewed the evidence, it made a lot of sense to me. So I think that it's more than possible that's actually the case. But we'll get there eventually. So, but the point is that, the whole historical framework eventually comes down to there were two choices a lot of times. One of your choices was to kill Julius Caesar or not to kill Julius Caesar. One of your choices was for Alexander to cross into India or not to cross into India. There were many different options. What if Julius Caesar didn't conquer Gaul and he lost to Vercingetorix? That never would have happened, because Vercingetorix did not have the equivalent of well-trained troops. And even if he did, let's say Vercingetorix managed to kill Julius Caesar and his troops, probably would have caused a huge rebellion and a military raising. Let's postulate this, because the Gauls, there's a long-standing hatred between the Romans and the Gauls, because the Gauls came down and kind of conquered part of Rome. They never stuck around, but they kind of beat them up. So they beat up the Romans and took over some of their areas. So there's a long-standing hatred between the Romans and the Gauls. But they're also considered a formidable enemy. So when Julius Caesar goes and takes it upon himself to conquer Gaul, he knows the history between the Romans and the Gauls, and so do the senators. And that's why they don't want him to go and do exactly what he goes and does. And unfortunately for Julius, he's successful, and the Romans say, hey, thank God you're successful, but you still defied our orders, so you're an enemy of the state now. That's exactly what happened. But let's say, what if Julius Caesar had eventually lost to Vercingetorix? Well, would the Romans, with their now long-standing military, highly trained military, have taken this defeat with their tail between their legs like they did the first time without their long-standing military? Hell no, dude. Hell no, they would not have. They would have taken that military to force and conquered Gaul anyway. 100%. So what happened if Julius Caesar died during that? What would have happened? Well, the Romans would have come in. Probably Pompey the Great would have actually come in and done it, because Pompey was married to Julius Caesar's daughter. And reportedly, Pompey actually loved Julius Caesar's daughter. Julius Caesar loved his daughter too. It was his pride and joy. Julius Caesar would have loved to leave his daughter his heirship, but she died in childbirth and all of that. But Pompey, if Julius Caesar had died in Gaul, Pompey would have almost been obligated to raise an army and defend him and go and fight in Gaul. And in fact, Pompey had the biggest military at the time. It's also a historical wonder that Julius Caesar did beat Pompey when Pompey's military was so much larger. But we know that Pompey's military was also spread out and not as well trained or well versed as Julius Caesar's army. And they were more well versed because they had just been fighting for decades, over a decade. It wasn't, was it 2 decades? Very long time in Gaul. And they were fighting all this time in Gaul, so they were very highly trained soldiers. Very experienced, highly trained soldiers. And remember, Julius Caesar was the best of them all. He was just as good of a commander as he was with chopping somebody's head off with a sword. That is a fact. So, Pompey would have had to come in and avenge Julius Caesar's death. So the Romans would have gone into Gaul anyway, but it would look very different. Many historians and this book that I was just listening to also pointed out a very important fact, that during the time of the civil war between Julius Caesar and Pompey, remember, this is after Julius Caesar's daughter, Julia, died in childbirth. Before then, Pompey would have never stood against Julius. Never. Because he loved Julia so much that he would have supported Julius Caesar through anything. This is written through all accounts. So, but what's interesting about that too is Pompey is reported to have wept when Julia died. But when Pompey wrote the letter to Julius Caesar, it was so cold and unloving and uncaring that Julius Caesar was reported to have gone into a fit of rage and, murdered a bunch of people because Julius loved his daughter Julia so much, and he knew that Pompey loved her. So when the daughter, so when she died, Julius would have thought that he would have gotten some condolences, but instead he got a single letter that states that they're declaring Julius Caesar an emperor and basically, an enemy, and basically a PS note at the bottom that says, "Oh yeah, by the way, your daughter's dead, and so is the baby she was carrying." Whoops. That is basically what it said, and Julius Caesar was so freaking pissed that he like reportedly just like murdered a bunch of anybody in his vicinity at the time. So it was crazy. And so that like drove Julius on in like a huge massive amount of rage. But what if that didn't happen? What if instead of her dying in childbirth, Pompey had voted to um, go and support Julius Caesar? Because remember, at the time of Julius Caesar and Pompey, there had been others who tried to establish single man autocratic rule or a kingdom, as in the old ancient Roman kingdom of the time of Romulus. But they were unsuccessful and seen as enemies of the state. But at that point, the consulship had gained so much different powers that one man rule was becoming more of the norm. So when Julius Caesar and Pompey were at civil war, many of the Roman people didn't pick one side or the other because they basically viewed it as, well, we're going to end up with one king or another king, whoever wins. This is very true. It was very true. Pompey was very much trying to become a king. He ruled many different provinces and he ruled them by proxy. He established other governors to rule in his stead, deputy governors to rule in his stead, which is insane, and nobody did that at the time. And so he did that because he was trying to establish one man rule. That's why his army could be out somewhere in Greece while he was in Rome making political campaigns and statements, because he was trying to be the king. And he was elected sole consul in order to fight Julius. And of course, we know he lost eventually. But what if he didn't win? Well, guess what? We might not have had the exact same Rome, but we still would have ended up with an emperor, no matter what. And it's interesting because Julius Caesar did not plan on leaving his kingdom. He planned on being a child rearing kingdom, and your heir becomes the next king. Julius Caesar planned on adopting the person who would become the next emperor, almost grooming them. In fact, he planned on Brutus being his adopted heir and adopted person who would be the next king after him, the next dictator after him. He planned on it being that way, but it didn't work out, obviously, as we know. And so, it's really, really interesting how the tides of history turn, because also when Brutus was conspiring against Julius, he was also going to Julius and whispering in his ear and conspiring with him against the other senators. I mean, this guy is like a Benedict Arnold to a T. He's a traitor of all ends. He's a double agent. He's a terrible person. So when Julius Caesar was going through everything, he thought the whole entire time that he could trust Brutus because he's been mentoring Brutus since he was like 7 or 8 years old. And now the kid's 18 or 16 or whatever. So it was totally different for him. So, but what if that didn't happen? What if Julius Caesar didn't get killed by Brutus? What if all of this, it got a cough. What if the opposite of all this happened? It's so interesting because history and life as we know it would not be the same. None of it would be the same. Even though Pompey and Caesar would have both been autocratic rulers, the way that they ruled the Roman world would not have been the same. Pompey probably wouldn't have declared himself a dictator for life, which reminds you they didn't really call Julius a dictator for life. It was he had the dictatorial powers for life. He had those powers. It's only in our later terms of history that we classify that as a dictator, as in its own classification in itself. He had dictatorial powers, but he was considered the consul and eventually considered something else. And Augustus adapted onto this model and eventually stopped being elected as consul and was eventually just automatically given by the Senate consul powers, dictatorial powers, and all these other things without actually holding the office of those things. So it was interesting. Other people would hold those offices, and yet Augustus had the powers of those offices. So it was so interesting to really think about that because while he had the powers of a dictator and an emperor during the time of his life, he wasn't called the dictator and the emperor. They called him the first citizen. And some historians say that Augustus, the title Augustus, means the revered one. So he was just a worshipped citizen. Is that what it was? Is that what they called it? So yeah, I guess that's what it was, what they called it and all that. Who knows? But he wasn't considered the dictator emperor that we know of now today. But what if he did? What if Pompey ruled and said, "Oh, I'm the king now. Forget the Rome, forget the senators, forget all of that. And what are you going to do about it? I got the biggest army in the whole Roman Empire." So you would look at that and you would say, well, it only makes sense because you're one guy, so you're just the king, But Julius Caesar said, no, I don't want to be the king. I didn't want to be a dictator. But unfortunately, I can't trust any of you. All you do is babble and talk and bribe and connive and all this stuff. Can't be trusted. So we're gonna change things up. We're gonna change the way of things. And so we're gonna do all these different things. And guess what? The people loved him for it. Turns out that even though during the Civil War they didn't think one versus the other, Caesar versus Pompey, was better than the other one. Once Caesar took power, the people loved him. They loved him so much that it caused 20 years of civil war until Octavian was able to fully take power. But it was so interesting because of the fact that if he didn't go and wasn't loved by the people, there wouldn't have been that civil war. The people would have said, "Oh, thank God you got rid of this guy. Bye-bye. See you later." So it was so interesting to me listening to this book and getting historical accounts and also having the book remind me of other things that I knew and remind me of things that I had forgotten or pushed to the rear of my memory. It was so interesting to me because it really shows how the world is not set in stone as we might think. While we look at history as being definitive and as being exactly what happened and that was the way it was supposed to happen, it's not necessarily true. And it's so interesting about how the world could have been shaped totally different if the opposite happened or if something didn't happen. And it blows my mind because we basically today in America are basically another version of Rome, more or less. And that's how our forefathers would have wanted us to see it as. But what if something's different happened and we wouldn't have been seen as a Roman, as a continuation of the Romans and the Greeks? What if it was another culture? What if it was something totally different? And it's so interesting because you may go into it goes into our scientific talks of parallel dimensions and universes, because what if in a parallel universe Pompey did win and Caesar didn't? Or what if Augustus didn't take power? Or what if all over down the line throughout history? Then that's the idea between parallel dimensions, is they did that might not have happened. That whole thing might have not have happened at all. And so history and the world would be completely different. So it's so interesting for me to think about that, and I thought it was awesome. And I love the book I listened to, and it was just fantastic. And I love talking about ancient Rome and history and the opposite and what could have been, and postulating on different universes and worlds. And it was just so interesting that I loved that we were able to have such a beautiful and long and detailed discussion on this conversation today. So that's it for us today, though. Much love. Remember to follow War Multiverse on all of your platforms and warmultiverse.com. Remember, you can watch us now on our website without having to even come in on Twitch and Kick if you don't like to do that. So that's great for you. And, I hope everybody has a wonderful day, wonderful week. We'll see you next week for episode 82. I'm loving it. I hope you're loving it too. Much love, y'all. Peace out. See you soon.